She waited outside my room and asked me a question I couldn't ignore. "Do you trust me?" It was one of those quiet evenings where the world outside felt distant, as if everything had slowed down just for a moment. I was sitting on my bed, headphones on, lost in the low hum of music that blended seamlessly with the faint scratching of my pen against a notebook. The room smelled faintly of my desk, old paper, ink, and the lingering aroma of a cup of tea I'd forgotten. Outside, the hallway was dim, bathed in the soft yellow glow of the ceiling light, quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator or the muffled sounds of life moving on the other side of walls. And then I noticed it, a subtle pause in the rhythm of the house. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, stopped just outside my door. I froze, pen stilling mid-word. The light from the hallway caught the edge of the doorframe, and there she was. My friend's older sister. Tall, poised, graceful, carrying herself with a calm confidence that seemed to fill the space without a word. Her hand rested lightly against the frame, and the faint scent of her perfume drifted in. A mix of warmth and something floral, something quietly intriguing. She tilted her head slightly, eyes meeting mine through the slight crack of the door. There was a pause, a hesitation that wasn't awkward but deliberate, as if she was testing the air, gauging whether I would react, whether I would rise to the moment. Then came the words, simple yet heavy with unspoken meaning. "Do you trust me?" The question hung there, suspended in the air like a fragile glass ornament. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. The casual phrasing couldn't disguise the weight behind it. My heart, which had been beating normally a moment ago, suddenly caught in my chest. It was a mix of surprise, curiosity, and a subtle rush of something I couldn't quite name. An unfamiliar thrill, soft and electric, that made my palms tingle. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Words failed me. I wanted to respond, to say something clever, something reassuring. But even my voice seemed too heavy, too loud for the delicate moment that had just settled between us. I noticed the way the light played across her features, the soft arch of her eyebrows, the quiet warmth in her eyes, the subtle tilt of her lips that hinted at amusement or expectation, maybe even patience. There was an unspoken tension, a delicate balance. She was standing outside my room, yet her presence felt like it had invaded the space, filling it with a weight that was at once gentle and impossible to ignore. I became aware of every sound, the soft scrape of her shoe against the floor, the faint rustle of her clothes, the quiet exhale that might have been her waiting for me to answer. I realized slowly that this wasn't just a question. It was an invitation, a test, and a moment of connection that neither of us could ignore. And somehow, even in the silence, even in my hesitation, I understood that nothing in that room would ever feel the same again. I stayed frozen for a moment longer, the question echoing in my mind, "Do you trust me?" It was simple, yet it carried a weight I wasn't prepared to unpack. The hallway felt smaller somehow, the air thick with expectation, and every fiber of my body was suddenly aware of her presence just beyond the door. I could hear her breathing soft, even, almost hypnotic, and it made my own inhale catch halfway. My fingers flexed against the edge of my notebook, knuckles whitening. Finally, I managed to answer, my voice barely above a whisper. I think so." The words sounded weaker than I intended, more uncertain than I wanted to appear, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything else. A small smile curved at the corner of her lips, not mocking, not teasing, but patient, as if she had anticipated this hesitation and was willing to wait. She leaned lightly against the doorframe, just enough to signal presence, not intrusion. "Good," she said softly, her tone calm yet somehow holding a subtle, compelling authority. "Trust isn't given lightly, you know. It's earned and tested." I nodded, unsure whether I was agreeing or simply caught in the moment. My mind raced with the impossible. She was my friend's older sister, an adult, someone I'd always admired from a respectful distance. But now, standing just outside my room, she seemed impossibly close, her presence both grounding and electrifying. She tilted her head, studying me as if reading a book written in gestures and micro-expressions. "So, "Tell me about your day," she prompted. Her voice was casual, but every syllable carried a warmth that made me want to confide in her, even about things I usually kept to myself. I hesitated again. I wasn't used to sharing, not like this, not with anyone. But there was something in her gaze, open, patient, genuinely curious, that made it hard to resist. Slowly, I began to speak, words tumbling out awkwardly at first. My mundane routines, my frustrations, a small anecdote that was silly but felt safe in her presence. She listened. That was what made it different. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't fill the silence with chatter. She simply existed there, a steady warmth outside the doorway, nodding gently, eyes attentive. Every so often, her hand brushed the doorframe closer to mine as if to steady herself, and I felt an almost imperceptible charge from the contact. My skin prickled. My heartbeat shifted into a rhythm that was both anxious and excited. It was strange how someone could feel both familiar and utterly new at the same time. I realized I was aware of everything. The soft scent she carried, the faint rustle of her clothes as she shifted weight, the way her gaze seemed to linger just long enough to make me notice it. There was vulnerability in her patience, a subtle invitation to share, to be seen. Not just as a friend or a younger boy, but as someone capable of trust, capable of closeness. By the time she finally straightened, stepping just slightly back to give me space, I realized I had said more than I intended. And yet, paradoxically, I felt lighter, a little braver. The first thread of trust had been extended, and somehow, in that simple act of listening and presence, a connection had quietly begun. After a few minutes of tentative conversation, there was a shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, that made the room feel different. The air between us seemed heavier with possibility, warmer somehow, as if the space itself had acknowledged her presence. She tilted her head slightly, eyes catching mine in that calm, confident way that made me feel seen. "Do you mind if I come in?" she asked, soft, patient, like she had been waiting for my permission all along. I hesitated, heart fluttering in an odd combination of anticipation and nervousness. The hallway had felt like a safe boundary, a distance I could manage, but now she was asking to cross it. My mind raced. This was my friend's sister, someone I'd always regarded with admiration from afar, someone I wasn't supposed to feel this. But there was something in her voice, the ease of it, that made saying yes feel natural, almost inevitable. "Sure," I whispered, stepping back slightly to let her in. She entered gracefully, the soft creak of the door blending with the quiet hum of the room. I noticed details I had never before, the faint perfume lingering in the air, the warmth radiating from her presence, the way her hair caught the lamplight, strands falling lightly over her shoulder. She moved with careful poise, yet there was an ease to her motion, a subtle comfort that put me slightly at ease even as my heart raced. "Show me what you were working on," she suggested, nodding toward my notebook. Her tone was light, inviting, never demanding. It was an unusual request, almost trivial, yet it carried an intimacy I couldn't ignore. I hesitated, then opened it, flipping to the page where I had scribbled a half-finished sketch. A note, a line of lyrics, something I'd never shown anyone. She leaned closer, eyes following the lines carefully, and I realized I was holding my breath. Her proximity was intoxicating, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me hyper-aware. I noticed the warmth of her shoulder brushing lightly against mine as she leaned to see better, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the familiar smell of my room, the quiet intonation of her voice as she commented on my work. She was close, yet respectful, attentive without being overbearing. Every movement, every glance, every small laugh carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. We spent the next several minutes in this delicate rhythm. Me showing, her observing, both of us speaking softly, carefully, as if our words alone could break something fragile if we weren't gentle. I told her about why I drew that particular sketch, why I wrote that line, and she listened, not just with her ears, but with her full presence. It wasn't interrogation or idle curiosity. It was attention, patience, empathy. At one point, our fingers brushed lightly as I handed her the notebook back. A subtle spark, a shiver that ran up my arm. We both froze for a heartbeat, then laughed softly, almost shyly, at the unspoken charge of the contact. That brief touch said more than words could. Trust, connection, closeness. By the time she finally straightened, a gentle smile on her lips, I felt something undeniable had shifted. The first thread of true intimacy had been woven. Not physical, not overtly romantic, but deeper, quiet, human, and powerful. She had stepped into my space, and in doing so, she had crossed the boundary between acquaintance and something more. Something that would linger far longer than the room itself. The room felt smaller now, though nothing had changed except the way I noticed her. She had stepped fully into my space, and somehow, that simple act had shifted the air between us. It was heavier, warmer, charged with an energy I couldn't name. My heart beat a little faster, each pulse a reminder that something subtle, but undeniably significant, was unfolding. She moved closer, ostensibly to help me with the small pile of papers I had scattered across my desk. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for a sheet, and the contact lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. My skin tingled at the warmth, and I became acutely aware of her presence. The soft scent of her perfume, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the faint rhythm of her heartbeat almost echoing in the quiet. I tried to focus on the papers, on the mundane task, but it was impossible. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, yet effortless, drawing my attention without words. When our eyes met, it was as if the room itself had melted away. She held my gaze steadily, patiently, her expression calm yet carrying a quiet challenge, a subtle invitation. I realized then that the question she had asked before, "Do you trust me?" was no longer a playful test. It was an unspoken promise, a door she had opened for me to step through if I dared. I hesitated, caught between instinct and restraint. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. The age difference, my friendship with her brother, the impossibility of the situation. Yet beneath it all, there was a magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. The silence stretched between us, taut and electric, filled with everything we weren't saying. Then she spoke, breaking the quiet in the gentlest way possible. "Sometimes," she said, voice low and warm, "trust isn't just about words. It's about presence. Being here, right now." Her tone sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to respond, to say something clever, to laugh off my nervousness, but my voice faltered. I realized that I didn't just want to answer. I wanted to be present too. Her hand brushed again, this time more deliberately, against my forearm as she leaned slightly closer to point out something on the papers. The contact was brief, yet the electricity lingered in the space between us. My chest tightened, a mix of anticipation and hesitation. Every nerve seemed to awaken, every sense heightened. I became aware of her warmth, the soft movement of her body, the subtle way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the quiet way her eyes held mine longer than expected. For a moment, it felt as if time had slowed. The tension was almost unbearable, yet entirely compelling. I wanted to move closer, to close the distance between us, but restraint held me back, fueled by both social caution and a respect I couldn't ignore. She seemed to sense it, a small, knowing smile curving her lips. It wasn't teasing, it was understanding, approval, encouragement, and yet it wasn't forced. It was natural. By the time she finally stepped back to adjust her position, I felt as though a quiet line had been drawn in the room, a line that we both acknowledged but had yet to cross fully. The tension remained, palpable and delicious, leaving me acutely aware of her presence, of my own feelings, and of the slow, inevitable pull drawing us together. In that silent, suspended moment, I realized something undeniable. Whatever this was between us, it had shifted. There was no going back to the casual distance of before. The first real spark of desire, gentle, restrained, and electric, had been ignited. After that charged silence, the room felt different, smaller, warmer, as if her presence had subtly reshaped it. The tension from before lingered, but now it was tempered with a quiet intimacy, a fragile trust that neither of us had expected to develop so quickly. She remained near, her eyes observing me with patient curiosity, as if she sensed the internal struggle I was barely managing to hide. I shifted in my seat, hesitant. My hands fidgeted, fingers brushing the edge of the notebook, twisting pens in a nervous rhythm. She noticed, of course. Her gaze softened, warm but steady, inviting me without forcing me. "You've been quiet," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Do you want to tell me something?" I swallowed, feeling the words catch somewhere between my throat and my chest. Part of me wanted to say nothing, to maintain the surface calm we had been pretending for minutes. But something about her presence, the steady patience, the way she leaned slightly closer without crowding, the subtle warmth radiating from her, made silence unbearable. Slowly, hesitantly, I began to speak. I told her about the thing I rarely shared. A fear, a disappointment, something that had haunted me quietly for months. My voice was uneven at first, breaking in places, but she didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Her hand rested lightly on my shoulder. Not pressing, just there. A grounding touch that made me aware of the warmth and subtle pulse of life that belonged only to her. "I've never really let anyone know this," I admitted softly, my gaze fixed somewhere between her eyes and the floor. "I guess I've always been afraid they'd think I'm too much, or not enough." Her lips curved into a small, encouraging smile. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly, her voice gentle but resonant. "It takes courage to share the parts of yourself that scare you the most." She shifted slightly, leaning in just enough that the warmth of her presence enveloped me. I felt a shiver, a nervous energy that wasn't uncomfortable, just alive, a reminder of how much I wanted to be seen, and how much she wanted to see me. The space between us felt intimate, almost sacred. I noticed the way her hair caught the light, the subtle tilt of her head, the soft rhythm of her breathing. Each detail grounded me, made me aware of the quiet bond forming in the room. Vulnerability, I realized, wasn't weakness. It was trust, delicate and powerful, and I was offering it freely because she had made me feel safe enough to do so. She didn't respond with advice or judgment. Instead, she let silence stretch comfortably between us, as if to say, "I understand. I'm here." I felt something inside me loosen, a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Her hand lingered lightly, reassuringly, and I found myself instinctively leaning just a little closer, drawn to the warmth and understanding she radiated. By the time the moment passed, I felt changed. Something fundamental had shifted, not just a deeper sense of trust, but an awareness of connection, of shared space and emotion, that made everything else in the room fade away. It wasn't romance yet, not overtly, but it was intimacy of the kind that lingers, subtle and undeniable, leaving me both exhilarated and quietly vulnerable. In that quiet, suspended moment, I realized that trust was no longer just a question. It was a bridge, and we were standing on it together for the first time. After the quiet intensity of our shared confessions, the room seemed lighter, somehow. The air wasn't tense in the same way anymore. It was charged, yes, but with something softer, something that hinted at curiosity and closeness rather than hesitation alone. I caught myself stealing glances at her when I thought she wasn't looking, noticing the way the light caught her hair, the faint warmth radiating from her presence, the subtle way she shifted her weight on her feet as she stood nearby. She caught me looking once, and our eyes met. It wasn't a casual glance. Our gaze lingered, holding a quiet question and the hint of unspoken acknowledgement. I felt my chest tighten, a fluttering in my stomach, a heat that spread to my cheeks. She didn't look away immediately. Instead, she smiled softly, a knowing curve of her lips that made my heart skip. It wasn't teasing or mocking. It was gentle, patient, and intimate. We began to talk again, this time lightly, laughing softly over trivial things. A joke about my clumsiness with the papers, a playful comment about my concentration. The kind of teasing that is innocent yet charged with the subtle electricity of attraction. It was a delicate dance. Words playful, gestures careful, glances lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. Every so often, Our fingers brushed while passing objects, or our shoulders almost touched as we shifted positions. Each contact, small and fleeting, felt magnified, laden with meaning that neither of us needed to speak aloud. She leaned closer once, ostensibly to read a note I had written, and I became hyper-aware of her proximity. The warmth of her shoulder brushed mine, and for a heartbeat, the world outside that room seemed to disappear entirely. My mind went blank, my thoughts consumed by the simple act of being near her, sharing space in a way that felt impossibly intimate yet entirely natural. "I like seeing this side of you," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "It's real, honest." Her eyes held mine, steady and warm, and there was a subtle weight to her words, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything we had shared so far. I felt a thrill, a recognition of desire that wasn't just physical, but emotional, rooted in connection, trust, and the quiet understanding we had cultivated. We laughed again, this time softer, almost shyly, the kind of laugh that comes from knowing someone deeply without words. I noticed how her hair fell over her shoulder as she leaned in, the faint scent that lingered in the space between us, the way her eyes sparkled with amusement and curiosity. Every detail was magnified, every gesture loaded with unspoken meaning. By the end of our conversation, it was clear something had shifted. The attraction wasn't urgent or overwhelming. It was a slow, simmering recognition of mutual desire, layered with trust, admiration, and respect. We both sensed it, both aware of the subtle pull drawing us closer, even as we maintained a careful, measured restraint. As she stepped back, giving me a small, almost imperceptible nod, I realized that the connection we shared had reached a new level. It was no longer just trust, just intimacy. It was a quiet acknowledgement of desire, unspoken yet undeniable, lingering in every glance, every touch, every breath in the room. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, nothing between us would ever feel ordinary again. By the time the evening light had softened into the quiet darkness of night, the room felt like a different world, one we had quietly built together. The tension that had crackled between us in earlier moments had settled into something warmer, deeper, and more enduring. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every small laugh now carried the weight of understanding and trust, and the unspoken acknowledgement of something more than friendship lingered in the air. She stood by the doorway, the faint glow from the hallway outlining her silhouette. There was a softness in her eyes, a mix of care, amusement, and something deeper that neither of us had dared to name aloud. I realized I was holding my breath, caught between wanting her to stay and fearing the moment might be fleeting. The world beyond this room, the hallways, my friends' expectations, the rules of ordinary life, felt distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was the space we had shared, the bridge of trust and connection we had quietly built together. "I should probably go," she said softly, her voice carrying that familiar warmth. But even in her words, there was hesitation, a gentle reluctance that mirrored my own feelings. She lingered, just enough for the air between us to hum with possibility. I stepped slightly closer, heart hammering in my chest. "Wait," I said, my voice low, steadying myself against the nerves and excitement pooling in my stomach. I don't want this to end yet." She smiled, that subtle, knowing curve of her lips, and leaned in just slightly. Our shoulders brushed lightly, almost accidentally, and the contact sent a quiet shiver up my spine. "It doesn't have to," she said, her tone gentle but full of intention. There was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet acknowledgement that this moment, however fleeting or prolonged, belonged entirely to us. We lingered there, sharing that delicate space between friendship and something more, letting the warmth of our connection settle into something lasting. Her hand brushed mine, this time intentionally, and we both felt the quiet spark of desire tempered by respect and care. It was a gentle affirmation, a promise of trust, a silent understanding that this connection was real, meaningful, and safe. Finally, she stepped back, giving me a small nod and a lingering glance. Her eyes held a promise without words, a recognition of everything we had shared, and the subtle acknowledgement that this moment had changed us both. I watched her leave, the soft click of the door closing behind her echoing in the quiet room, leaving a lingering warmth that wasn't gone, even in her absence. I sank back onto the bed, heart still racing, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. I felt changed, more open, more alive, more aware of the quiet power of connection, trust, and desire. The room no longer felt empty. It carried the echoes of laughter, the warmth of presence, and the subtle thrill of what had begun. In that quiet, suspended moment, I realized something important. Endings don't always mean separation. Sometimes endings are a beginning, and in this case, whatever path lay ahead, whether together, uncertain, or simply changed forever, we had discovered a bond that neither time nor circumstance could erase. The last thought that lingered as I exhaled softly was simple, yet profound. Trust, closeness, and desire had found their place, and somehow, that was enough. If this story left your heart racing and your mind wondering, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more slow burn romances, and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you trust her?